to our second session of our discussion on teaching about racism. And the session today is going to be led by Elizabeth Antus and Gregory Freed. For those of you who don't know one or the other or both of them, Elizabeth is assistant professor of the practice in theology and has been teaching Pulse for a number of years. Her areas of research are in feminist theology, sexual violence, constructive appropriations of Augustine today, and the intersections of theology and mental health. She's been working on taking an anti-racist liberationist approach to these various topics. Greg is a member of the philosophy department and in his third year here at Boston College. He also teaches Pulse. This whole series is being taught by or led by Pulse faculty. And he also teaches courses on ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of law, and just war theory. And he's looking to expand Pulse to graduate students in the philosophy department starting next fall. He gave me a long list of his research, but most of his publishing is on Heidegger, and he's finishing a book on Heidegger, Plato, and political philosophy. He's also director of the Mirror of Race, and he had given us a link to that webpage, and I had too few minutes to look at it myself, but realized that there's a wealth of materials there and really encourage everybody to look at it. So rather than my doing all the talking, let me turn it over to Elizabeth and Greg.
Thank you, Ruth. I was going to take the first stab at this today, and Elizabeth was going to come second. So let me just quickly jump in by saying that I think about the texts that I want to use and am interested in, and I want to present this discussion very much from the perspective of a teacher who is concerned about the students in the classroom and how they can come to grips with the very difficult issues that we're addressing here. My own interest in the question of race goes back a long time as a feature of my interest in political philosophy and the critiques and defenses of classical liberalism, especially classical liberalism as instantiated by the American experiment, which is riven by the contradiction between its stated ideals and the realities of its history. So that's where I'm coming from in my own work and where I try to bring texts in to my teaching. And I'm particularly interested in talking today about the texts that I use in introductory level classes and how I go about teaching. I realize that this is a session on texts and not as much on teaching, but I just can't help making that linkage. So what I wanted to start by saying is that the texts that I find most helpful, especially in classes like Pulse and other introductory classes in the core, sorry. I should have turned off my phone. Sorry, everybody. The texts that I find most helpful in teaching in introductory courses in the core are ones that do a really good job straddling the disciplines, because for two reasons. One is that the students in core classes come from all sorts of different disciplines, and it's really valuable to have texts that have a good chance of reaching them where they live intellectually. The other is that books that straddle the disciplines have a better chance of making connections for the students with other texts that we're studying in the class that may be more traditionally classic. And that is also very useful, I find, in reaching the students. So I'm just going to mention the two that I have found most useful in recent years. One of them is, this is a very good edition. I find this is The Portable Frederick Douglass, edited by Henry Louis Gates and John Stauffer. It includes Douglass's first autobiographical work, his narrative, as well as many other short essays and talks, lectures that he gave that are really wonderful. So just to say why I think Douglass is such a good example of what I'm talking about is that in a course where I'm teaching political philosophy, a figure like Locke, for example, Douglass is speaking very much within a natural rights tradition about political rights and his own rebellion against the world that he found himself in, but also his engagement with the America as he found it in his time. So in this collection is also his very famous lecture of the early 1850s, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which is also a magnificent work to include because of its connection to American founding documents, as well as a political philosophy tradition, which I think is made lively for American students in the context of considering the problem of race historically in America. The narrative is also magnificent as a work of literature for students who are interested in narrative, but also in the artistry of the use of words. Douglass is nothing if not a master orator beginning at a very young age. His writing is simply magnificent, and students are touched by his skill as a writer that brings the material alive for him. And the narrative itself is really impactful. Then for a course where I'm teaching theological work, Douglass's own confrontation with religion, the way he both despairs in the face of religion, but then finds his way into a religious language and is influenced by religious rhetoric, I think is another powerful link to the kinds of texts that students will be reading. And finally, of course, for students who have an interest in history, there's just an endless supply of connections from his narrative that can be found. So the other text that I wanted to mention, and which I've passed around a handout on, is Charles Mills's book, The Racial Contract. And this is a book that came out in the 1990s and has in philosophy become a kind of modern classic in the field. I think it's fair to say that Charles Mills is a figure who is, if he didn't emerge from critical race theory, is at least congruent with critical race theory. And so he's an important entry point for students who want to get a sense of how critical race theory has engaged with various disciplines. And so what Charles Mills is doing, I think, in a very accessible way, especially in his first overview chapter of this book, which is, I think, very accessible to students, is to engage with the European social contract tradition and pose a very serious question about whether that social contract tradition, which is so powerful in our way of thinking about politics, is inflected in important ways by racial realities. Is the social contract tradition itself a raced tradition? That's his fundamental question. And he poses it well, he explores it well, and he does it in a way that I have always found to be extraordinarily impactful to students as a way of getting a conversation going. I'm happy to talk more about the handout that I've provided that summarizes the aspects of his argument and the conceptual structure that he's provided, but I'll leave that to the question and answer because our conversation is probably the most fruitful thing that we can engage in. The other set of texts that I'm interested in at least directing you to are the ones that are linked by Elizabeth's handout, the ones that I brought together for the Pulse module on racism. Those cover a variety of different aspects of philosophical discourse about race, but also different areas in the history and the sociology of race and racism in America that I think are important for students to be exposed to. I'm sure other people might have different ideas about how to break that down, but I invite you to take a look at that handout to consider things that you might want to use in your classroom. I can say more about it. And then there's my own work that I've done with the Mirror of Race website and the film that I worked on called Before the Trees Was Strange with one of my co-founders, which I've given you access to with a password protected website where you can view the whole film. We put that film together as something to encourage conversation, especially to encourage storytelling conversation among our students. And I'm happy to talk more about how I've done that in my classroom, how I've done that with Derek at public events that we've done. The website for the film also has an entire film guide that I use in my classes to encourage students to reflect upon themselves. And when I'm teaching books like The Racial Contract or Frederick Douglass, also in conversation with those works, so they can think about how bringing their own stories into dialogue with the film, with the works we're studying, can add to our classroom experience. I think that's enough for the moment. I prefer to just take questions later, so I'll pass it on to Elizabeth.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So just in terms of a few teaching sources I've used, and I think almost all of these are listed in the handout I gave, which I'll screen share again in a second. I watched the first installment of this workshop series, and so one source that I found particularly helpful, especially for getting more granular in the analysis of race, is that article by Linda Martine Alcoff about the Black-white binary and how Asian American and Latinx communities do or do not fit into that. That's also not something I found. That's something that Marina had found and recommended to the Pulse faculty at least a few years ago. And it's a little old at this point. I think she wrote it in 2002, but it's still shockingly relevant. Really not a lot has changed in terms of her analysis. So I actually just taught that one today in my Pulse class, and like we had a great discussion about it. We've really been focused a lot on anti-Blackness for, I think, there are good reasons for that, of course, but I think making the analysis more granular at this point, like it did kind of open things up. So I think that's an article that teaches well. And again, that's in the document that I constructed, and I'll screen share again in a second anyway. That is paired for me, and again, I'm teaching in the Pulse core with, I'm sure, a text that a lot of you have taught before, Kelly Brown Douglas's Stand Your Ground. That's helpful just as a work of theology to kind of see, how a womanist theologian is actually thinking about anti-Blackness in relation to major topics in the Christian tradition. Sorry, I don't know what that was. So, I find that helpful. It's also helpful in Pulse because we still, I want to note something, we still have the year-long structure. So I've had these students in the fall. So we had a long time to talk about biblical hermeneutics. So when we get to Douglass and she's interpreting the Exodus story in a particular way, or she's interpreting certain gospel stories in a certain way and saying, here's what we're going to lift up, here's what we're going to reject. My students do have a foundation to understand that already. So that's something to be mindful of. I would have to rework that if I were just doing everything in one semester. King's Letter from Birmingham City Jail is another classic that I'm sure people have used. I do notice sometimes some of my students are like, he's so polite in the letter, and that's really not my read of what's going on. So that's a pitfall I've noticed sometimes with that letter, especially from white students. Not all white students, but sometimes they're like, he's just so nice. And I really would like that to not be the takeaway from that letter. Just be nice, and then people will stop being racist. The other piece, and this one I pre-circulated, was that piece from that evolutionary scientist who focuses on genetic research and race, Joseph Graves, who's a well-known authority on this. I just taught that one today with the Alcoff piece, and that went really well because it sort of goes back to what Greg is saying in that, you know, especially if we're teaching in the core, there's so many, most of them are not majors, right? They're not theology majors, they're not philosophy majors. So I liked having just a little piece from a scientist who could basically explain the sort of genetic dimension of what we're talking about here. Because I have gotten questions from students like, okay, well, if we want to say race is a social construct, why are we doing DNA testing? How does this connect with what we know about human beings physically, biologically, genetically? And I am not an evolutionary scientist, but I do think this piece is really good. I wanted somebody from the science community to help buttress the narrative that I'm trying to construct, which is namely that race is a social construction, but I've been using mostly theological, philosophical, and historical sources to do that. So I don't know, I'm trying to help those pre-med students especially. So I could say more. The other piece, this is not on my list, but it's something that showed up in our apartment at some point, but this is a new book that came out. I haven't had a chance to read it. It got blurbed by our very own Sean Copeland and Nicole Flores at UVA, so who's also a doctoral alum. So I'll just hold it up for a second. This might be something good to think about. I haven't wanted to focus the race conversations only around Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter comes into our conversations organically, of course, but I think if you want something directly on this, it might, I haven't had a chance to read it and vet it and think about it, but it's, you know, it's blurred by people who know what they're talking about. So that might just be a good resource. Everyone get that? Birth of a Movement, Olga Segura. And then the other thing to say too, and I'm sure probably a lot of you are already aware of this too, but something that I think can just kind of help me be in the right headspace when I'm teaching a lot about race and then trying to be anti-racist with other topics as well is that Black at BC Instagram account. Just, I don't know, because whenever a professor shows up there, I'm like, what do they do? Because I'm trying to like basically take it as a what not to do kind of. And so as somebody who is not, you know, I'm white and I am not an expert on like issues of race or racism. It's not my research area, but I have been trying to like do my work for years now at this point. But I think just helping refine my instincts pedagogically, I look at that Instagram account, you know, monthly at least, and that can be really helpful too, because I actually like the unfiltered quality of it. You can get what students actually feel like here. And sometimes with some of the stories of like professors committing like overt racist actions, I almost can see what the professor was trying to do and then seeing how it actually ended up being harmful. So like, I also view that as kind of another source to think about. Okay, and then if I just screen share for just a second, I don't need to like belabor this and go through every single thing, but obviously, so as you can see, as Greg mentioned, the racism module is linked up there. So that gives you a wealth of really well organized sources that Greg labored to put together. And then I divided the list into two types. So the first list is influential resources from a variety of disciplines. I think you kind of have to be interdisciplinary when talking about this, especially if you're teaching in the core. So some of it, honestly, like, this is not an exhaustive list. It's just sort of what are some of the greatest hits if you want to know what's up with race and racism. And these are things I've read. These are things I've taught. There are some things on here that are on my list to read, but I have not gotten to yet. So I just tried to really think about what I knew about the sources. And then if I'm being totally honest, Andrew helped round out a few things for me that I was missing. So some of it is, activists writing their autobiography or memoir. Some of it is philosophers, etc. And then the second list is theology, Christian theology specifically. And so I tried to hit some of the classics that have formed me, but I also tried to hit scholars that are of a younger generation and writing now, like turning things out now in particular. And so, and obviously all of these people many of them have written more than what's here, but I just was like, if you don't know where to start, here's maybe some books to start with if you're just trying, not only to full screen, not only to figure out teaching resources, but again, to like try and just be more informed as an instructor for yourself. Because I'm not, that's something I'm still working on too. There are things that I want to know about racism that I'm not going to communicate all of that to the students necessarily, but it's like, I want to be more informed. And so just the level of homework year in and year out that I've been trying to do, and that I know a lot of us have been trying to do, is pretty staggering. So, but I think, I think about it's knowledge-based, but it's also refining instincts about how to run a classroom around this. And so, yeah, it's been a lot. And I have found, and this is the last comment I'll make, that our conversations about racism have been going pretty well in Pulse. I think some of that might have to do with the Pulse program, in particular, in the way the students self-select, and the fact that, like, of my students, about half of them are students of color, and something like a quarter, approaching 30%, are Black, which I know is completely different. It's noticeably different from the 4% that are Black at BC. I think that's the number, right? And so I don't know why that's happening. I think a lot of that is just Pulse in particular, but I think that might also be shaping the dynamics in the classroom too, I'm sure. And so that also makes me worried about the students I'm not catching, but I can't do anything about that right now. So I guess those are some thoughts I had. So some of it's about what we're assigning our students, and some of it's about like what we're learning for ourselves. And then I guess that last piece is connected to me with questions about departmental culture and culture at BC in general, because the last thing I'll say is just a lot of what has become clear to me from that Instagram account is that students of color, especially Black students, may feel supported by individual faculty, but overall feel like the institutional culture here is very hostile. So I don't know how to fix that. I just wanted to throw that out there, and I look forward to hearing from you all. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, so first of all, we are recording, and what we did last time I think worked well. You should feel free to bring up something that you can then ask that we not include in a publication of the recording. So we did actually delete certain segments before posting it last time. Actually, I shouldn't say we, Susan did it. And so that this should be a space for free conversation and comfortable conversation, as if we were in a room with the door locked and nobody else coming in. But we'd at the same time like to be able to share what is shareable beyond the walls of people who are able to join us right now. So let me open the floor, and you can either wave your hand or use the raise hand function, and I'll
This
try
is a
to.
question for Elizabeth or Greg.
Yeah.
Just curious, do certain texts appeal to certain groups of students? Do Latinx students resonate in a special way with authors who are Latinx? Or do you find that those kind of racial categories don't apply when you're dealing with texts in class?
Do you have an answer to that, Elizabeth? I don't have any immediate easy answer. I just love teaching the Douglas. I find that he reaches pretty much everyone, but I don't have a wider net to throw than that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, I taught the Alcov reading today, actually, and we had a pretty robust discussion of it. Some of my Latinx and Asian American students were saying, like, I really like this. Like, it names a confusion I feel. But a lot of the Black students were talking too. So that, I don't want to overemphasize the sort of affinities between authors and students. But yeah, I did hear a couple of comments about like how, yes, this is naming something about how confusing it can be to be a Latinx person, for example.
And I would just say about the Alcoff piece, the black-white binary, which is so dominant in the American discourse, that is very important. There's been a lot of news lately about how Asian Americans have been subject to a frightening increase in hate and even assaults as a result of the COVID crisis. And so it's easy to get myopic about the black-white binary. And I think a piece like Alcoff's is as salient as it's ever been for that reason.
Tiffany.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. Can either of you guys speak to how you would go about teaching these texts for, for TFs such as myself? It's, I don't want to just plop a text in the middle of a week or whatnot without any prep. I think it probably takes a lot to really, build up to their being prepared to read the text and then have a conversation. So just some thoughts on how you go about doing that. Would be great.
Greg, do you want to go first?
Well, let me just start with the Douglas, because often that's when I'm teaching core or another early intro course, that's something that I bring in early and often interweave with other readings in the class. I take a very student-oriented approach to teaching that text. I simply ask them to find passages in the text that were most striking to them. I call it the stub your toe method. What arrested you in your reading of this chapter of the text? What didn't you understand? What shocked you? What surprised you and pleased you? Anything that brought you up short with the text, and can you explain that? Why it brought you up short as a window into how this text reaches you. And that places it in their hands. They don't have to be experts to begin talking about how the text impacted them. And I find that to be the best approach with a text like that. And then you can add on to that, depending on where you're bringing it into a course. What resonance do you find with reading the other texts in our class? So with the Douglas, depending on what you're doing, there's so many other ways that it can sort of spread its tendrils into the material that's also very productive for the students. So I really try to put it in their hands as a text it's a narrative, it's his narrative, and to get them to engage with him almost personally in that narrative is really good.
Which Douglas are you talking about? Because
The narrative,
his autobiography.
First publication that, the early 1840s, the thing that he brought out that made him world famous.
Yeah, I would add to that, and I'm aware that some of this has to do with teaching and pulse, although I did try to do this when I did Exploring Catholicism a few years back, though there were different dynamics there. But I mean, I don't know, part of it is not just starting conversations about race when there's a reading about it late in the semester. I think and I don't execute this perfectly by any means, but something I've been trying to do, it's aspirational and I'm trying, is that basically from day one to be like, here's some sort of commitments in the class. I mean, yes, it's a social justice class, and it's nice to be able to fall back on that like Pulse is a social justice program, so I don't have to like reinvent the wheel and fight on my own or anything like that. But I think as part of that, I've been like, so we're going to be thinking about like what liberation actually means for the poor, for people of color, especially for Black people in this country, for women. Like, I invite all of you into that, and we're gonna, you all probably have different levels of experience and facility with the topics, and that's totally okay. But that's a commitment of the class, and that's where we're starting. And like, I hope you stay. But like, yeah, it's a social justice class. That's kind of the way it is. And so I think just trying to normalize that and be talking about the issue of racism throughout the entire year helps when we get to specific readings that are very explicitly on that. Some other general points I keep in mind too is that like I'm pretty text-based in my approach, in the sense that I'll be like, let's go to this passage, and then I'll read it and I'll be like, let's analyze it now. And so a lot of it isn't necessarily always starting with their experiences. It's starting with texts and trying to break things down into a digestible form for them. But then if I do ask them more existential questions that ask them to connect their experience, whatever their racial or ethnic identification is, with the readings, I'm very clear that I'm like, I'm going to ask you a question about like, if you've had any experience like this, you can write it down and think about it. And I am never, ever going to cold call people to talk about their experiences, ever. When I'm asking questions about like, oh, have you been a victim of racism? Like, I never, ever do that. And just to signal that really clearly, because there are power dynamics here. And I don't want the students of color to feel like hyper visible and like they have to represent all other Black people or all other people of color in general. Like, I think that that's wrong to make students feel that way. So if I do ask more personal questions, I make sure that they know they do not have to respond. They can just write things down. So the questions where I'm really forcing them to talk are about analyzing the reading. So that's not so much about the Alcoff reading, but it is about just general dynamics about how to run these conversations. I will say that my students, like the vast majority of them, do talk quite a bit. So a lot of them like to share, actually, but I think signaling at every turn, like, you don't owe me your sadness or like racialized trauma around these things. We are going to talk about them, but you don't owe me or your peers that, is really, really important, especially when we like talked about the MLE vandalism recently. So I'll stop there.
I would just say I agree very much with Elizabeth about weaving the discourse through the course and not just lumping it in one place. So for example, when I do teach the Douglas, I'm just looking back over my syllabus for the fall in Pulse. The way I teach him is by having him read at the same time as other classic texts. So they're reading over the course of about 10 sessions, Douglas along with Plato and the Book of Job, and so that they get to move from different kinds of thinking contexts to talk about this material and connect it, so that they're spending a lot of time with Douglas over 4 or 5 weeks with him as a touchstone for looking at these other texts. I also have them reading the New York Times and other papers during the course that I'm teaching, so they can also connect what's going on in ancient texts a text like Douglas to what's going on in their world around them. Just to follow up.
Great, thank you, Lisa.
You're muted, Lisa.
Yeah, sorry. So I have a practical question that's for Liz. I'm teaching a class right now on Christianity and violence, and it's for undergrads, and the course has like several sections of different types of violence, like gender-based violence. And all of these do reoccur throughout the class, but there's like a 2 or 3 week focus on a particular issue. And the issue of race and violence and Christianity is about to come up in 2 weeks, not this week, next week. So I have some of the things that you've mentioned on the syllabus, like Massengale and Sean Copeland and Olga Segura, and there's a bunch of posts on the political theology website about anti-Blackness. Andrew has one in there, and others. But my question is about linking these to concrete experience. And I do have readings that are more practically driven, like from Commonweal Magazine or America. That's the Olga Segura, or about Black Lives Matter. But my question is, when we have had an incident, incidents, like all the attacks on Asian Americans, or the racism here at BC and the incident in the dorm, I have collected, with the intention of sharing them, a Globe article on the racist incident at BC, and another long article on a variety of actions against Asian Americans. But I'm sort of two minds about whether I should put these on the syllabus as readings or wait until it comes up in the conversation. But I sort of feel like, especially with a classroom that's majority white, there can be a tendency to hold it at arm's length. And so it's like, we're talking about this stuff that's going on out there that we're not really involved with. And I do have 3 Asian students in the class, so that will be very relevant to them. So I'm kind of thinking I'm going to just add these or suggest that they read these. Like, is that good, or is that too confrontational in a way?
Oh, okay. That question ended up being different from what I thought. Okay.
Well, answer what you think would be. Yeah.
It's just funny to me. The way you ended it is not how I tend to think about things. Like, I don't worry about being confrontational.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I was smiling and hesitating.
Well, I don't mind being confrontational, but is it more of the ilk of putting these students on the spot, similar to bringing up their personal experience?
Yeah, I think, right. So I think my own instinct, and I'd be curious to hear what others think too. My own instinct would be to signal that there's going to be a conversation about it. Here are the readings, and lay some ground rules ahead of time. Say, like, here's the questions we're going to run through. And I'm not going to cold call people to talk about personal experiences of victimization if that's not what they want. But I would actually be very upfront about having the conversation, that you do want them to read things and you want them to think about things according to whatever questions you want them to think about them in. And so and I would never, I would not call on those Asian students to.
No, I would not do that, but it's sort of obvious that they're sitting there and we're reading these articles on this topic.
Yeah, and they, some of them may talk, some of them might not, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But yeah, my instinct would be to actually draw, like, be very clear that this is going to happen, and that these are some of the ground rules and the questions you are interested in hearing about them from. And it doesn't have to be necessarily about their personal experience of victimization, but it can be about maybe the climate that they notice at BC. Make them more an observer of their context rather than having to name their victimization, which could be re-traumatizing in the moment.
I mean, I would never just call on them to address that. But I think a really good idea that you have, that Marina McCoy mentioned something similar last time, is to come up with some specific questions
Yeah.
rather than just saying, let's discuss this article or these incidents. Like, what are some specific things to think about in relation to the more theological, like the Massengale or the Copeland articles that are on the syllabus?
So when we talked about the MLE vandalism a few weeks ago, I told them the class before that we were going to talk about it in the next class. And when we started that class, I said I had 2 questions. I did say, I wrote on the board, what is your reaction? And then I wrote, what do you want BC to do? And I said with the first one, like I gave them a chance to write their thoughts down. And I said, there's space if you want to voice an answer to the first one, but you, again, none of you owe me or your peers your emotional reaction, but there is some space for that. And then some people did talk about how it felt. Like I have students who live there. And so, but mostly we focused on number 2 about what they wanted BC to do. And I also tried to be clear that like, I've thought about it too. And if the conversation paused, I would throw in an idea and ask them what they thought about it to make sure that I wasn't like putting all this labor on them, but rather wanted to hear from them because I care about their voices.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, all I would say about that is if you clearly scaffold such a conversation in the context of the prior course content and the course goals, it won't feel plunked down for the students. Almost randomly. The way I handle that in my teaching is to require the students to be reading on a weekly basis in the newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post. They have free access to those things as BC students. And I will frequently every week assign 1 or 2 students to email me anonymously stories they'd like all the students to read and then discuss in class as connected to course themes, op-eds or stories. And that way, it's easier when you have something from the news that you want them to read to say, now it's my turn. I would like everyone to read this. And you have an ongoing course narrative about doing that. So it feels much more natural to the students when you do.
Okay, I just hung up that phone. Yeah, Greg, you had also said that you were eager to be asked about the storytelling conversations.
Oh, sure. So I do think that there's this terrible problem about making underrepresented students in your class the spokesperson for the perspective of an entire community. And I think all of us would prefer not to do that. And even with the best of intentions, a student might feel pressure to do that, even if that's not the faculty member's intent. So one does want to be very careful. At the same time, it is really good for students to talk to one another about these things. So one technique that I've developed, and this is from my friend Derek Burrows, the director of Before the Trees Was Strange, who has been a professional storyteller and working with various audiences for nearly 40 years now. He has a wonderful exercise that I've used now multiple times in my classes. After showing my film, after reading the material in the class, what I ask the students to do, I pair them up in breakout rooms if it's on Zoom, or if it's in the classroom, I break them up into pairs and ask them to tell any story about themselves to their partner about identity and how they had a surprise about their identity in their lives. And it could be absolutely anything. And that gives all the power to the student to tell another student their story. And the goal afterwards is for the other student to tell your story to the rest of the class. And what's powerful about that is it makes the other student have to receive the story and not taking notes and try to understand it well enough to tell it again to the rest of the class. And it's valuable for the student who's told it to their peer to hear their own story back, not from themselves, and to talk about that. And because they've had the power to decide what story they're going to tell, it takes the burden off of them to represent in some way. They get to decide how they're going to represent. It could be about them discovering that they're not the baseball player they thought they were going to be, or what have you. Or it could end up being a story about cultural, racial, gender identity that they have felt comfortable sharing. But I do a lot of scaffolding in the course before that. I only do that in the last weeks of the course. When I'm confident the students trust one another and have the vocabulary to deal with this. And the students love it. They really find it very, very powerful to hear what has happened in other students' lives that they're willing to share. And they know in advance they can do that. And it's been prepared for them by the film Before the Trees Was Strange, which is a very gentle film about dealing with really difficult issues of race, identity, betrayal in a family, and so on. So that's worked for me.
I think that one of the things to me that the two of you named is that there's some areas in which Pulse is fundamentally different. I'm personally still in mourning over the second semester of the core, and Mary Ann's agreeing. And that's a huge challenge in terms of developing relationships with the students. So the question is, how do we adapt some of these ideas when we're trying to do so much in the core? I mean, in the dialogue classes, we're trying to represent 2 religions in a semester. And, and so the amount of time that we have to build towards a discussion of race is essentially halved or quartered from what happens in Pulse. So that's a huge challenge. That's something to think about. Andrew, you wanted to?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add 2 thoughts. One was that I find it helpful to always teach at least 2 texts, like whether it's, if you're going to focus on the Black community, 2 authors at least, as opposed to only 1, and to have the students think about the similarities or differences between them, or a sense of sometimes even debate or disagreement within a community. And I think that can help to prevent any sense of a sort of homogeneous racial identity. And it's a way to provide debate where the debate is not only kind of a Black perspective versus some other white perspective, but it's debate in the Black community about how to cope with or respond to various things going on. So, I mean, a classic example would be to teach sort of King and Malcolm X together. But in my perspectives class, I teach King along with Toni Morrison. And I ask the students to think about how each of them are understanding what love means. And it's not necessarily a debate, but there are differences in terms of how the concept of love is formulated. So that's just one thought. The other thing is, in terms of identity, I do find that it's helpful for students can start getting anxious if they feel like their identity has to be predetermined by a certain category of race or gender or so on. But on the other hand, you don't want them to think that to leave your class thinking that those categories don't matter, and that they're all just sort of souls living in a vacuum or something. So I try to help them think about the relationship between personal identity, that each of them actually is unique in their bodies and in the experiences they've had, but then also, how we're all living in a kind of social context So I suppose that's just a general way of saying that the notion of identity itself is something to, I think, pluralize and complicate for them. So no one feels like they're getting kind of stuck in a box. So those are just two thoughts that I offer.
Christian.
Thanks so much for the presentations and the helpful bibliographies. I really appreciate it. I have an underdeveloped question about how, besides Elizabeth, you're helpful, like, don't put people on the spot, let them write, but not be cold called. How you best respond when either defensiveness or hesitancy is evoked from teaching around these issues. I think defensiveness, it almost be, I can remember like in different cities where I was, because I feel like your response is almost more important than anything on your syllabus all semester when you're kind of teaching. But I also just had an experience of students more comfortable with what, Andrew, you just said, like comparing Towns and Copeland, or actually Prevost and Charles Taylor, than they were wading into a debate. And I haven't read the Alcov, I look forward to it, about like the uniqueness of anti-Blackness compared to an Asian American author saying, like I'm thinking of Kiji Joy and Katie Grimes. So the uniqueness of anti-Blackness versus how whiteness functions for other groups, almost a hesitancy to like, well, who am I to kind of adjudicate those types of claims? I wonder just how you've navigated either type of reaction.
Yeah, well, with the question about defensiveness, it depends. It kind of depends on the situation, obviously. It depends on how upset the student is when they're talking, but I feel like if they are defensive but still capable of having a conversation, like I will engage them usually. I guess that's more my go-to. I don't know if that's right or not. And I will, like, you know, I try to be kind, but also sometimes people need to have things firmly stated, even if not for their sake, for the kind of class climate that we have. And I think that that's really important. And if it doesn't feel like it's going to get resolved in class, like we might move on, but then I might reach out to that student later. I've often found that sometimes I have to do some of that reaching out work outside of class, actually. And so that sounds kind of simple, but I think it's been a good tool to have.
It is a really important and a very difficult question. And I have a number of strategies to try to deal with that in advance. The thing I would say, if you do end up with a student like what Elizabeth has described in your classroom, is always to remember that a seed planted can always grow long after a course is over, or maybe a few weeks later in that very course. So I always try to take on the role of a welcomer. You know, everything has its limits, and I'm sure there would be times when I would reach that limit, but I try to keep it as open as long as I can. So if something like that were to come up in my classroom, I'd say, well, people argue that, but then what's at issue here? I try to frame these things around what's the question that's driving the debate. And if that's what you think about it, what aspects of the phenomenon do you have to do a better job of accounting for? And leave them with questions that still ought to challenge them around this issue that can be fertile ground for the seed to grow in later. The other way I try to handle it is through the reading of the newspapers, because I invite them to pick op-eds from differing perspectives on these kinds of issues that we can then discuss in the class. And what that does, it allows students to put on somebody else an idea that they want to hear talked about, but they don't want to be the origin of it. Does that make sense? And by my generally trying to take a position where I am presenting what people argue for them then to discuss, it takes the burden off of them from introducing things they want to hear talked about, but they don't want to take responsibility for, just in case it's a, some view that they'll then be excoriated for. That's what's so tricky about all of this.
Can I just respond to, when I was dean of the STM, where you're training ministers, okay, something different than we're doing in Morrissey College. I always had to remind my faculty that the classroom is not necessarily to convert them, which is a hard thing for people training ministers to understand, that they're there to engage ideas and texts, sometimes very uncomfortable ideas and texts that they're not going to agree with, and that's okay. And if they come out with things that I personally find reprehensible or sort of a misreading, it's sort of like, the best that I can do is simply say, well, no, I think I have a different reading of that text than you do. But at the end of the day, they may or may not, as you say to my faculty, we can pray for conversion, we can't force it. So, so if they're really opposed to a text, they're opposed. I mean, there's not a lot that can be done. So I think Elizabeth, the way you dealt with this was exactly right, which is like, I'll talk to you about this later, but we're going to move on now,
Megan, I see Megan's hand. I also see that it is after 5 o'clock already. So let's take this as a last question, and then we'll close up. We'll wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Elizabeth. I think this last topic touches a little bit on some of what came up in the first session a couple of weeks ago. And I guess I am wondering the dangers of presenting certain words, readings, positions in the class relative to the students' own sense of self, especially minoritized students, and how you go about balancing presenting an argument that could, for a 19-year-old, feel like an attack on their very personhood, with a desire to sort of educate them about certain perspectives and why those perspectives might exist. So how do you hold those tensions?
Elizabeth, you want to take that? I'm happy to talk about it too.
Well, I wanted to clarify, because I thought I wanted to make sure I'm understanding the question. Like, is the question about how to navigate debates, readings, etc., that might make minoritized students feel attacked because something is being discussed about race? Yeah. I'm gonna let my thoughts percolate, Greg.
I don't know. It is so hard what you're saying, because in order, for example, to teach anti-racism, the students need to be exposed to what racism is. So how you can't completely shield them. I think every teacher has their way of trying to make the students trust them. And I have my techniques. I've described some of them to you, by which I scaffold their trust in me. And I'm sure each of you do as well. But the key is to make them understand that they will be heard. And especially, I think they will get that you are trying to be an anti-racist. But if I'm always learning, and I always foreground the fact that, hey, I'm a white man teaching these issues in the classroom. I know I have a lot to learn. And I make my own vulnerabilities visible around these issues, and hope that gives students the permission not to feel like feeling vulnerable is something that's wrong, but that they can find ways to express through the class, and that I will hear them. For the most part, that's worked for me, but every teacher is different around these extraordinarily difficult issues. So I don't know how to answer it in a sort of uniform general way.
I agree with that. The thing I would add, because I was just sort of trying to do a mental calculation of the readings I've had in my class around race and or racism. And I guess some of the concern you're voicing, Megan, kind of went into my selection of texts in the first place, in the sense that if we're talking about racism, is it being identified as such by the author of the text to analyze it as a social force? And along with that, like, is it respectful of the group of people that's being talked about? I think that was just a question that went into every reading that I selected. So we do talk a lot of, we talk a lot about racism. It's violent, it's upsetting, but I think it's packaged and labeled as such in a way that's respectful of the people who've been victimized by those forces. So I don't know if that's getting at it. I think just trying to make sure things are framed in the most respectful way possible by the readings kind of helps with some of that. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a very nice point, by the way. It's why I like Douglas, rather than say reading a text like Huckleberry Finn, where the racism is right there in front of you, but it's not explicitly dealt with by the author. Whereas in Douglas, it's ugly, it's brutal, but he's immediately confronting it. And I think that's what I choose text like that.
Yeah. Oh, the other, I mean, just sorry, I actually did have another point that can help round it out. I mean, this isn't about racism as such, but when we read Augustine's Confessions in book 9, when he's talking about his mom who's died, you know, Monica, and he's like mourning that, there is this really disturbing passage where he talks about how good she was at avoiding getting beaten by his father. And obviously his framing of it is highly problematic. And so we basically take the entire class and go through and analyze his logic about how this is upholding patriarchal violence. And then he actually talks about the violence that his father enacts against their maids, but he doesn't care about that as much. And so we do an intersectional analysis of that passage. So I think, you know, but we've already talked about Crenshaw at that point. So I think just having some of those tools in place and then helping them use tools on texts that are problematic, like that's worked well for me, even though that's not about racism exactly, but it's related.
That's good.
So I'm not sure that we quite want to end on this note, but at the same time, I think our time is really up. So let me remind you that our next session is on April 7th, and that Matt Kruger and Mary Troxel will be leading discussion on developing practical and integrative assignments. I think is from what we've seen today already, we see that these discussions are building one on the other also. And so that there will be connections that are important. And I know I have all sorts of other directions that I'm going with this a little bit, because I teach this with the added dimension of anti-Semitism thrown in, and also upsetting conservative Catholics, especially with teaching them modern methods of reading scripture and things like that. So all of these things challenge students in some ways that there are definitely analogies going on in terms of the pedagogy. So I'm very, very grateful to the two of you, Elizabeth and Greg, and to the Pulse faculty in general for helping us think about these things.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for your questions, everybody.
Bye.